Few rulers in the pages of human history have left a legacy as shameful as that of Tiberius Caesar Augustus. When he ascended the throne as Rome's second emperor, he was praised as a disciplined and successful military leader, but his rule soon descended into a darkness and depravity that horrified even his contemporaries. The events said to have occurred during the period when he voluntarily withdrew to the island of Capri off the coast of Naples were so disturbing that historians still debate how much of them are true. Yet the accounts of Suetonius and Tacitus in particular reveal that behind the imperial splendor lay a darkness that defied human comprehension. This story shows that absolute power not only leads to absolute corruption, but also gives birth to a monster with boundless desires. When Tiberius donned the imperial crown in AD 14, the people of Rome felt great relief. He was an experienced general who had secured the northern borders and was known for his administrative skills. As the adopted son of Augustus, he was seen as the ideal candidate to continue the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But behind this stern and distant-looking ruler lay a much darker world. His youth was shaped by personal tragedies: the death of his beloved brother Drusus, his forced separation from his first wife, Vipsania, and a loveless political marriage to Augustus' notorious daughter Julia left deep scars on Tiberius' soul. Over time, these wounds turned into major cracks in his personality. This transformation did not happen overnight. In the early years of his reign, Tiberius presented himself as a balanced ruler who maintained imperial stability by continuing Augustus' policies. He reduced public spending, avoided unnecessary wars, and respected the authority of the Senate. But those who knew him well sensed a growing anger and deepening despair within him with each passing year. The death of his son Drusus in AD 23, likely by poisoning, was a point of no return for him. Consumed by deep grief and growing paranoia, he began to withdraw from the public. The man who had once commanded legions across Germania now shied away even from appearing before his people. In AD 26, Tiberius made a decision that would stain his name forever. He left Rome and retired to the island of Capri off the coast of Naples. The official reason was a desire to escape the burdens of state, but in reality, he was creating a refuge where he could indulge his darkest desires freely. Surrounded by steep cliffs and isolated from the outside world, Capri became the perfect stage for atrocities that would shame even the most conservative Romans. 12 villas were built across the island, each a center of excess and horrific secrets. Though the Senate continued its duties in Rome, real power was now exercised from this island. Tiberius ruled through letters of terror, each sentence he sent becoming a death warrant. Most who traveled to Capri either returned, traumatized, or were never seen again. The emperor surrounded himself with astrologers, especially the sinister Thrasyllus, whose prophecies fueled his paranoia. Every senator became a potential traitor, every rumor a possible sign of conspiracy. The empire was now in the hands of a recluse who communicated with the outside world almost exclusively through execution orders. What set Tiberius apart from other tyrannical rulers was not just his cruelty, it was the perverse creativity he displayed while satisfying his desires. Ancient sources speak of scenes that pushed the limits of human morality. Tiberius' sexual obsessions, particularly when directed at the young and vulnerable, took on a horrific dimension. Both boys and girls were brought to Capri under various pretexts, and none returned unchanged. Some children were trained as minnows, learning to swim between the emperor's legs in his pool and bite him to amuse him. These disgusting poolside games were only the beginning. According to in scenes orchestrated by the emperor, youths were forced to engage in intercourse in groups of 3, and Tiberius called these performances chains. Erotic works brought from the East became handbooks of depravity in his hands, and the rooms were decorated with obscene scenes. Even the most corrupt members of the court were horrified by these twisted innovations. One of the most terrifying practices was the use of spintrii, small sexual slaves, torn from their families or sold. These children were trained solely for the emperor's pleasure, and their entire lives were devoted to satisfying his desires. Some were forced into acts so extreme that there were no words in Latin to describe them. As a result, the word spintrii was never again spoken in respectable Roman conversations. Most did not survive this horrific service, and those who did were killed to ensure they would keep the secrets. This corrupt system was not confined to Tiberius alone. To sustain this lifestyle, he needed accomplices. and he found them among those around him whose ambition was matched only by their depravity. Young aristocrats seeking to rise in the court offered their own children or siblings to the emperor, while others became agents who brought new victims from across the empire. A system of exploitation emerged in which the human body became a commodity. Officials who resisted or hesitated were charged with treason, their property confiscated, and their families destroyed. Thus, Tiberius made participation in his perversions a condition for survival. The stories emanating from Capri grew more horrifying each time they were told. Rumors spread of nursing infants being abused and noble virgins being forcibly defiled in supposed religious rituals. One of the most chilling accounts claimed that when Tiberius was done with his young victims, he had them thrown off the cliffs, and soldiers waiting below killed any who survived the fall. Not every detail of these stories may be true, but what matters is that the Romans saw their emperor as someone capable of such revolting acts. The very existence of these rumors is enough to demonstrate the magnitude of the fear Tiberius inspired. Beyond the sexual depravity lay a deeper sadism that permeated every aspect of his rule. The emperor derived great pleasure not only from inflicting physical pain, but also from causing psychological suffering. He would first tell those sentenced to death that they had been pardoned, giving them hope, and then issue the execution order a few days later. He deepened their agony by forcing families to witness the executions of their children, and sometimes even to participate in them. One senator was forced to attend public ceremonies and engage in cheerful conversation immediately after his son's death, although Tiberius explained these horrific practices as loyalty tests. In reality, he simply enjoyed watching people suffer. The line between governance and sadism had now completely disappeared. Accusations of treason became one of his most effective tools of terror. A simple word, gesture, or glance could be considered an insult to the emperor. Informers known as delatores multiplied throughout the empire and enriched themselves by seizing the property of those they accused. An accusation in itself meant death, as almost no one was acquitted in Tiberius' courts. The methods used to extract confessions grew increasingly cruel and inventive. The emperor himself designed tortures such as forcing prisoners to drink excessive amounts of wine and then binding their genitals. As their bladders filled, they experienced unbearable pain. The Senate, once the pride of the Roman Republic, had become a trembling assembly of sycophants betraying one another out of fear. Senators competed to heap praise on Tiberius and had their colleagues executed at the slightest suspicion. Even showing mercy increased the risk of becoming the next victim. The great institution that had once stood against Hannibal now knelt before the madness of a single man. Some senators chose suicide over trial to protect their families' honor and property. Even natural death was no longer a refuge. Tiberius put the dead on trial, confiscated their property, and destroyed their monuments. He did not hesitate to execute family members for mourning too intensely. The law had become a tool of oppression. Old statutes were reinterpreted to serve the emperor's paranoia. The crime of maestas insulting the majesty of the Roman people was expanded so broadly that almost any behavior could be prosecuted under it. Bringing a coin-bearing Tiberius portrait into a brothel, criticizing a poem he had written in his youth, or consulting a fortune-teller about his health could all be punishable by death. All trust within Roman society vanished. Friends and even family members began to see each other as potential informers. Conversations at banquets ceased, replaced by heavy silence. Writers destroyed their works to avoid being accused of inciting rebellion. The intellectual life that had blossomed under Augustus withered under the poison of fear. Parents warned their children not to mutter even in their sleep, for a single word could lead to denunciation. A society once built on debate and the exchange of ideas began to disintegrate under a climate of terror. During his time on Capri, Tiberius' mental state deteriorated further. His appearance, never particularly attractive, became almost grotesque. Ancient sources wrote that his face was covered with boils and sores, caused by both illness and the ointments he used. He hid his baldness with wigs and covered his ravaged face with heavy makeup. The once proud general had become a diseased creature hiding on his island. His paranoia reached such a level that he had his food tasted by prisoners before eating it, and filled his bedroom with soldiers, even while he slept. The governance of the empire gradually fell into the hands of the leader of the Praetorian Guard. For years, Sejanus wielded almost unlimited power in Rome, and while Tiberius lived on Capri, the empire was effectively under his control. But this alliance did not last. In AD 31, Tiberius turned against Sejanus as well, accusing him of conspiracies like so many other victims and having him executed. Everyone associated with him was destroyed. Even children were killed alongside their parents, despite Roman law traditionally protecting minors. In one particularly horrific case, a young girl was raped by the executioner before being put to death, because virgins could not be executed. The final years of Tiberius' reign were the peak of madness. Now in his 70s, the emperor's sexual appetite had diminished, but his cruelty had grown even greater. His fear of death became an obsession. He consulted astrologers daily and executed anyone who predicted his demise. At the same time, the resulting picture became a dark cautionary tale that echoed throughout history. Even the people of Rome seemed to sense the stench of evil emanating from Capri. Stories and rumors about the emperor grew more terrifying with each telling. Parents used Tiberius as a bogeyman to make their children obey, and graffiti cursing his name appeared on walls. Those caught risked execution. Even among the elites who benefited from the imperial system, the number of those who felt that something was rotting at Rome's foundations was growing. On the surface, the empire continued to function. Taxes were collected, trade continued, and borders were guarded. But at the heart of this order, a deep moral decay had begun. The religious consequences of Tiberius' depraved behavior added another dimension to this darkness. The Romans held their gods in great reverence, and many believed that the emperor's immorality had brought divine wrath upon them. Earthquakes, floods, and fires during his reign were interpreted as signs of the god's anger. The corruption of religious rituals for the emperor's pleasures was seen by the public as an insult to sacred values. Some of the mystery cults that had flourished during Augustus' reign withdrew underground to avoid being used in Tiberius' perverse ceremonies. Even Rome's spiritual world was tainted by the hand of its ruler. The economic cost of Tiberius' reign is often overlooked, but its impact was significant. The constant confiscations filled the imperial treasury, but destroyed entrepreneurship and economic dynamism. Wealthy families hid or quickly spent their fortunes to avoid attracting attention. Investments stalled because no one wanted to appear too successful. The economy turned into a parasitic system based on denunciations and confiscations rather than production. Even on Capri, the expenses for the emperor's pleasures, villas, guards, and the continuous procurement of victims consumed resources that could have been used elsewhere. Paranoia also harmed foreign policy. Foreign envoys had to wait years to be received. The rewards or punishments of a visit to Capri were unpredictable. The children of allied kings were held in Rome as guests, effectively hostages. In the east, the great rival Parthians watched as Rome turned inward and decayed. Control over the frontier regions weakened. Governors became too concerned with their own safety to fulfill their duties. The disciplined structure that had built the empire was disintegrating from within. Art and literature also bore the marks of this dark era. Great poets fell silent or turned to mythological and harmless themes. Historians preferred to write about the distant past rather than contemporary events. Visual arts either devolved into crude pornography, serving the emperor's depraved tastes, or became mundane to avoid danger. The cultural flourishing of Augustus' era vanished under an atmosphere of fear. Even architectural priorities changed. While Augustus had built temples and public structures, Tiberius built pleasure palaces on Capri and torture chambers in Rome. The situation of women was one of the most tragic aspects of this period. Countless women were sexually assaulted, and women from noble families faced horrific choices. Mothers were forced to offer their daughters to the emperor to survive. The wives of convicted men were often executed or enslaved, and their children were scattered. The few women who survived, such as Antonia Minor, did so only by making immense compromises. Traditional Roman family values meant nothing in the face of the emperor's lust. Medicine and science, which had advanced during the early imperial period, nearly came to a standstill under Tiberius. Physicians focused less on advancing medicine and more on finding cures for the emperor's ailments and producing His obsession with astrology allowed pseudoscience to eclipse real science. Natural philosophers limited their research out of fear that too much curiosity could be fatal. The tradition of rational thought inherited from ancient Greece retreated before superstition and fear. Even the Roman army, once the pride of the empire, became corrupted, Officers were promoted based on their willingness to procure victims for the emperor or denounce their colleagues. The Praetorian Guard turned into an instrument of terror against the Roman people. Soldiers who once dreamed of glory on the frontier were now tasked with throwing children off cliffs or torturing senators. The legions on the borders were still effective out of habit, but the warrior spirit that had conquered the Mediterranean had long since died out. The Roman legal system, once a symbol of justice, became a farce. Laws were interpreted solely to serve the emperor's interests. If a defense was too zealous, lawyers were accused of crimes, and judges feared acquitting defendants. Acquittal was seen as defiance of the emperor, so courts competed to deliver guilty verdicts. Principles that would later form the foundation of Western law were turned into instruments of oppression. As Tiberius grew older, his fear of assassination became an obsession. Even the tasters of his food had their tastings checked by others. Guards monitored each other, and his astrologer Thrasyllus interpreted even the slightest natural phenomena as omens. Yet, ironically, Tiberius' death was caused not by assassination or conspiracy, but by natural causes, or, according to some rumors, by a gentle intervention from his successor. The man who had lived for years in fear of death ultimately faced it alone. When he died on March 16, AD 37, the hatred felt by the people was openly displayed. As soon as the news reached Rome, people celebrated in the streets. They shouted, "Throw Tiberius into the Tiber," demanding that his body be thrown into the river like that of a common criminal. The Senate, freed from his reign of terror, initially refused to deify him. However, under the intervention of his successor Caligula, a funeral befitting an emperor was held. Even so, the ceremonies were superficial and lacked the genuine atmosphere of mourning seen at Augustus' death. Debates about Tiberius continue among historians even today. Some revisionist historians argue that ancient writers exaggerated their accusations, and that Tacitus and Suetonius were motivated by political bias. According to this view, the fact that the empire remained stable and prosperous during his reign is proof that the functioning of the state remained intact. Despite his personal failings, some aspects of these arguments may indeed be valid. The empire's fundamental institutions did not collapse. Taxes continued to be collected, legions defended the borders, and the Roman order, at least on the surface, appeared to endure. Some ancient sources also likely exaggerated their accounts out of hatred for Tiberius, yet the sheer volume of testimonies, the consistency of the narratives, and the palpable fear reflected in documents from the period make it impossible to deny that, even if the details were embellished, the core brutality was real. The psychological impact of Tiberius' reign lingered over Rome like a shadow long after his death. Romans now knew that their emperor could be not just a bad ruler, but a monster capable of deliberate evil. The Principate system that Augustus had built did not prevent tyranny, it created the conditions for tyrants to arise. This realization deeply undermined the bond of trust between ruler and ruled. From then on, every emperor would be closely scrutinized for signs of Tiberian tendencies, and even the slightest hint of paranoia or oppression would be met with suspicion. The Senate, once the pride of the Republic, would never again regain its former honor and independence. Practices invented during Tiberius' reign, treason trials, networks of informants, the institutionalization of private perversions, would be revived by the tyrants who followed him. Even death did not mean salvation for Tiberius' victims. The children abused on Capri, the senators tortured in Rome, the families destroyed by false accusations, all of them were reduced to mere numbers in the records of tyranny. Yet each number represented a life cut short by the emperor's madness. The child slaves known as spintrii were erased from history. Although their fates remain uncertain, it is clear that most did not survive. The moral wound inflicted on Roman society did not heal for generations, perhaps. It never truly did. The physical legacy of Tiberius' reign was stained by this shame as well. The villas on Capri remained empty for years, regarded as cursed places. Even when later emperors visited the island, they did not stay long, as if the stones themselves still carried the memory of what had happened. The torture chambers in Rome were demolished, but their locations continued to be spoken of in fear. Archaeological excavations on Capri have revealed traces of grand constructions, but no direct evidence, perhaps mercifully, has been found to confirm the horrors described in ancient sources. Some secrets were destined to remain buried by history, although modern dictators are often compared to Tiberius. Few have so thoroughly fused political power with personal depravity. The tyrants of the 20th century generally ruled through terror, but kept their private perversions separate from state affairs. Tiberius, however, merged the two, turning depravity into a function of the state, and in this respect, he remained almost unique. For this reason, his story should be read as a stark warning of how deeply human nature can sink when all checks on power are removed. It is not easy to understand how the Romans endured such a monster for 23 years. Fear was, of course, the greatest factor. Resistance to terror often meant death. But there was also the precedent effect. The Romans had embraced the Principate system established by Augustus because it brought peace and stability after years of bloody civil wars. Once they had traded their freedom for security, reclaiming it became almost impossible. The Senate had willingly surrendered its powers. To reclaim them would have required a courage that tyranny had already extinguished. There were instances of individual resistance, but they never coalesced into organized opposition. Social and cultural factors also facilitated Tiberius' excesses. Despite its civilized facade, Roman society had always harbored brutal practices within it. Gladiatorial combat, slavery, and the exposure of unwanted infants were all considered normal. The emperor's actions were extreme by comparison, but not entirely alien. This made it easier for the public to rationalize, ignore, or dismiss what was happening as merely an extreme example of Roman norms. The role of the helpers who stood beside Tiberius deserves particular condemnation. He could not have maintained his reign of terror alone. He needed agents to find victims, guards to carry out orders, informants to fuel his paranoia, and sycophants to legitimize his behavior. Some deluded themselves by claiming they acted out of fear of death, while others amassed wealth and influence from the suffering of the innocent. Most of these second-degree monsters were never punished after Tiberius' death and rejoined society with their ill-gotten gains. The consequences of Tiberius' reign extended beyond Rome's borders. Allied kings watched in horror at the immorality into which the leader of civilization had fallen. Peoples who had once admired Rome's laws and order now questioned whether the empire truly represented civilization or merely organized savagery. Rome's power as a bringer of order to the world was severely weakened. Peoples who heard the stories from Capri were far more resistant when Roman armies arrived. In their lands, the religious and philosophical movements that rose during this period were attempts to make sense of such evil. Stoicism, with its emphasis on inner virtue independent of external circumstances, offered hope to those crushed under tyranny. Eastern mystery religions promising salvation in the afterlife appealed to masses who believed that justice in this world was no longer possible. Thus, Tiberius' evil laid the groundwork for a profound spiritual transformation in Roman society. The literary legacy of Tiberius' era is found more in what was not written than in what was. The silence of writers speaks more powerfully of the atmosphere of fear than words ever could. By the time historians were finally able to record events, years had passed, and all that remained were whispers, memories, and documents that had escaped censorship. These gaps mean we will never know the full extent of what happened. How many victims vanished without a trace? How many stories were too horrific to ever be written down? Perhaps the silence itself is history's most powerful testimony for the modern reader. Tiberius' story is not merely an ancient horror tale, but a much deeper warning. It shows how quickly a civilized society can descend into barbarism when checks on power are removed. It reveals how fear can paralyze good people and drive them to inaction. It demonstrates how evil systems sustain themselves by corrupting everyone they touch. And perhaps most disturbingly, it reminds us that such vast capacity for evil is not found in inhuman beings, but within human nature itself, merely waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The death of Tiberius, though a moment of great relief for the Roman people, was only a superficial comfort. His passing did not eliminate the systemic problems. His successor, Caligula, would demonstrate that imperial madness was not a deviation limited to one individual, and would prove that the structural foundations of the reign of terror Tiberius had created remained firmly in place. Rome had established a form of government in which the character of a single man could shape the lives of millions. This system, while occasionally producing virtuous rulers, more often paved the way for new monsters to emerge. Still, the fact that so few emperors were able to combine administrative skill and personal depravity as lethally as Tiberius did is perhaps the faintest consolation one can offer about this dark era. Archaeological evidence remains insufficient to confirm the accuracy of ancient accounts. The ruins found on Capri confirm the luxury and splendor of his life, but no direct evidence has been unearthed to support the horrific acts described in the texts. This absence has led some historians to dismiss the stories as but absence of evidence never equates to evidence of absence. Moreover, Tiberius had both the motive and the means to erase the traces of his worst crimes. It is hardly surprising that victims thrown from cliffs left no archaeological trace. Researchers still debate the medical and psychological aspects of Tiberius' behavior. Some experts suggest that the disfigurement and skin conditions on his face were related to sexually transmitted diseases, creating a vicious cycle in which physical decay accelerated mental collapse. Others argued that the toxic effects of lead, used in Roman water pipes and wine vessels, contributed to mental deterioration. Yet, while such factors may have worsened his mental state, they cannot explain or excuse the calculated cruelty and systematic depravity that defined his reign. Economic historians point out a paradox. Even at the height of terror and corruption, the Roman economy did not collapse. Trade continued, taxes were collected regularly, and infrastructure functioned. This shows that large systems can endure for a time even under mismanagement, but it also raises a deeply unsettling question. How many merchants, officials, and citizens simply carried on with their daily business while horrific crimes unfolded around them? The gendered dimension of Tiberius' crimes is of particular importance. Although there were both male and female victims, the most vulnerable in Roman society were women and children. The law did not protect them, and social norms were powerless against the emperor's limitless authority. Mothers forced to witness the abuse of their children, virgin priestesses subjected to rape, and noblewomen reduced to slavery. Their stories became tragedies, echoing through the darkness of this era. There are very few figures in history comparable to Tiberius. Cruelty and debauchery have appeared in other rulers, but almost none combined them as completely and systematically as he did. Nero gained infamy for his excesses, but his were theatrical and not as calculated. Caligula indulged in similar perversions but lacked Tiberius' deliberate methods. Within the gallery of monsters, Tiberius holds a unique place. He was a ruler who used the full machinery of the state to enact his personal corruption. The horrific legacy of Tiberius became a kind of propaganda tool for later emperors. Compared to him, even ordinary rulers appeared merciful. After the trauma they had experienced, the people and the Senate had such low expectations that anything not involving torture and oppression was considered good governance. A people who had seen the worst would now be grateful even for mere neglect. In this sense, Tiberius raised the bar of horror so high that subsequent rulers unwittingly benefited from the standard he had set. The philosophical repercussions of his reign troubled Roman thinkers for generations. If the gods were truly just, how could they allow such great evil to reign for so long? If virtue was to be rewarded and evil punished, why did tyrants prosper while the virtuous suffered? These questions shook the foundations of traditional Roman belief and led many to seek answers in new doctrines. The problem of evil, embodied in the figure of Tiberius, became a serious philosophical challenge for Roman thought. For those who lived through this era, the psychological scars never healed. Senators who sent their friends to death to save themselves never overcame their guilt. Parents who could not protect their children from imperial cruelty carried lifelong trauma. Even those who remained silent bore the weight of their silence. The generation that survived Tiberius' reign was marked by what they had witnessed or failed to prevent, and this trauma haunted Roman society for decades. The art world also bore traces of this contradiction. In early sculptures and coins, Tiberius was depicted as a stern but respectable ruler. But later, representations either concealed the truth or idealized it. This gulf between official art and historical accounts became a symbol of the horrific crimes committed beneath the mask of imperial honor. Although Capri is presented today as a tourist paradise, this raises an ethical problem. Millions of visitors come each year to admire the island's beauty, but few confront its horrific past. The villas are presented as archaeological curiosities, yet each is a crime scene. Capri's breathtaking landscapes are also potential sites of murder, and for that reason, the island will forever bear the weight of history. The legal precedents established during Tiberius' reign continued to have an impact for centuries. expanding the crime of treason to encompass every word and action gave future tyrants the opportunity to turn the law into an instrument of oppression. Practices such as extracting confessions through torture, executing children, and collectively punishing families became normalized. Even just rulers could not completely erase this legacy. Corrupt laws proved far more enduring than the death of a corrupt ruler. In conclusion, Tiberius' reign transformed not only politics, but even education in Rome. Whereas young nobles had once prepared for public service, through training in rhetoric, parents now taught their children the art of survival, how to live without drawing attention, how to flatter without appearing weak, and how to detect signs of imperial wrath in time. These new skills replaced the ideal of virtuous citizenship that Rome had once cherished. Traditional Roman education had been built on virtue and civic consciousness, but in an era when virtue meant denouncing others and civic duty required participation in extrajudicial executions, that education had become almost equivalent to suicide. A generation grew up learning to hide their thoughts and trust no one. During Tiberius' rule, the international slave trade entered a new phase. A special market emerged for young and attractive slaves, purchased not just for labor or service, but specifically to be sent to Capri. Merchants, having learned the emperor's physical preferences, began to select their goods accordingly. Pirates and kidnappers found an easy market for their victims. This commodified form of slavery, designed to serve the emperor's pleasure, represented one of the darkest aspects of the Roman economy. The same routes that carried silk and spices also carried children to their deaths. Environmental historians often emphasize the striking contrast between Capri's natural beauty and the tragedies that occurred there. The island, which became a symbol of perversion, also possessed breathtaking cliffs, crystal-clear waters, and fragrant gardens. Tiberius' villas were architecturally impressive, and their remains still fascinate visitors today. The coexistence of beauty and evil creates a unique cognitive dissonance. It reminds us that evil does not always grow in darkness. Sometimes it takes root in places that appear to be paradise, deepening the corruption. The influence of astrology in feeding Tiberius' paranoia is also noteworthy. Thrasyllus and other court astrologers provided pseudoscientific justification for the emperor's fears. By reading threats in the stars, they gave earthly tyranny a cosmic legitimacy. This combination of superstition and power was especially destructive. Senators were executed on the pretext of planetary alignments, and children were abused on dates associated with astronomical events. The transformation of knowledge into an instrument of oppression represented another dimension of Tiberius' evil. Physicians during Tiberius' reign also faced impossible ethical dilemmas. They were asked to keep torture victims alive for further interrogation, to care for the emperor's body, knowing what that body had done, and to examine children for his pleasure. Some refused and faced the consequences, while others justified their participation by believing they were preventing greater suffering. The medical profession's collaboration with evil, even under pressure, opened deep ethical wounds and left enduring questions about professional responsibility. In the face of systematic cruelty, the demographic consequences of Tiberius' reign are difficult to measure but significant. Beyond the immediate victims, there were destroyed families, unborn children whose parents had been killed, and extinguished bloodlines. The already dwindling Roman aristocracy suffered a severe blow. Entire family networks were wiped out. The genetic and cultural loss to Rome was immeasurable. According to some historians, this destruction during Tiberius' reign hastened the empire's eventual decline by eliminating the traditional leadership class. The literature of this period clearly reflects the effects of censorship and fear. Writers developed complex codes and allegories to express dangerous ideas. Historical metaphors became so subtle that only certain people could grasp their meaning. This enforced subtlety enriched Latin literature, as writers became masters of implication and indirect expression. Yet it also came with a great loss. How many works were destroyed by their authors? How many ideas were never written down? History's silence speaks as powerfully as the words that were recorded. Tiberius' architectural legacy consisted primarily of his villas on Capri, which required massive resources to construct under difficult terrain conditions. This technical achievement stands in sharp contrast to the moral decay that occurred within them. The Roman engineering that built aqueducts to carry life to millions also constructed palaces for the systematic abuse of children. This union of technical genius and moral blindness defined much of Roman civilization, but it reached its peak in Tiberius' structures. For modern ethicists, Tiberius represents a textbook case of pure evil. Unlike rulers who committed atrocities for ideological or military reasons, his evil was entirely personal. He inflicted torture and abuse, not for Rome's glory or to spread a belief, but purely for pleasure. This, in one sense, simplifies moral judgment. There are no competing goods to weigh, but it is also more disturbing. We are confronted with evil that exists solely for its own sake, that derives pleasure from suffering, and that requires no higher purpose. The survival tactics Romans developed during this period became a cultural legacy, passed down through generations. They learned to speak without saying anything, to express enthusiasm without showing loyalty, and to survive in a world ruled by fear. These became fundamental Roman skills. The wound to social trust was deep and lasting. Even after Tiberius' death, Romans remained suspicious and cautious, trained by terror to always expect the worst. The open and argumentative character of the Republic was replaced by a society of survivors. Religious responses to Tiberius' evil varied widely. Some Romans lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile divine justice with the emperor's impunity. Others turned to mystery religions that promised justice in the next world, if not in this one. Some developed more complex theologies that saw evil as part of a divine plan. The rise of Christianity in later centuries was due in part to this promise of ultimate justice and its explicit moral condemnation of the kind of evil Tiberius embodied. The spiritual void created by the reign of terror was waiting to be filled. The economic cost of maintaining this regime of terror was enormous but often hidden. Beyond the obvious expenses of Capri's villas and the Praetorian Guard, there were the costs of paying informants, procuring victims, and purchasing silence. Corruption spread throughout every level of government as officials learned to profit from the suffering of others. The diversion of productive capacity to serve the emperor's depravity and paranoia represented a colossal misallocation of resources. Rome was wealthy enough to afford this waste, but the possibilities of what could have been achieved if those resources had been used elsewhere are unimaginable. From a military historian's perspective, Tiberius is a case study in contradiction. The brilliant general of earlier years ultimately descended into a paranoid isolation that weakened the very system he had built. During his reign, Rome expanded very little militarily, and as attention focused on internal affairs, some territorial losses quietly occurred along the borders. The difference between General Tiberius and Emperor Tiberius shows how power can change human character, or perhaps how different roles can reveal different aspects of one's personality. The discipline and strategic intelligence that had given him great advantages on the battlefield turned into ruthless calculation when applied to civil administration. The role of alcohol and other substances in Tiberius' behavior remains a subject of debate among historians. Ancient sources report that he drank heavily, especially in the final years of his life. Some historians argue that chronic alcoholism might explain both his physical deterioration and his loss of moral boundaries, while others claim it was not a cause but a result, a way of silencing what remained of his conscience. The relationship between substance abuse and evil actions is complex, yet in Tiberius' case, wine seems to have erased even his last moral restraints. The transformation of sexual violence into state policy reached its peak under Tiberius. Rape had long been a tool of war and domination, but Tiberius institutionalized it during peacetime. The organized structure of abuse, the bureaucracy created to facilitate it, and the normalization of child exploitation at the highest levels of government all pointed to a situation unprecedented in the ancient world. Previous conquerors had used sexual violence as a weapon. Tiberius turned it into a way of life. The harm inflicted on the victims was immeasurable and often ended in death. The geographical distribution of Tiberius' victims illustrates the reach of imperial power. Although most cases occurred in Rome and on Capri, the network supplying victims extended throughout the empire. Provincial governors learned to identify potential victims in their regions. Merchant ships carried not only traditional goods but also human cargo. Corruption spread through the entire system like a disease, radiating from the center to the periphery, demonstrating how evil at the top inevitably contaminated the entire structure. Comparisons with other periods of state terror reveal both similarities and the unique aspects of Tiberius' reign. The use of informants, show trials, and arbitrary executions are common to many oppressive regimes. But the fusion of political tyranny with personal sexual abuse on such a scale is rare. Most dictators separate their public and private crimes in some way. Tiberius' innovation lay in turning his personal perversions into state policy and using the full power of the empire to satisfy his desires. The psychological profile of those who rose to prominence under Tiberius is profoundly disturbing. Successful courtiers, rising informants, and enriched human traffickers. What kind of people were they? The sources provide names and details of individuals who combined intelligence with an absolute moral void. They understood the system, exploited it skillfully, and built their careers on the suffering of others. Many of these secondary monsters outlived their master and carried their toxic talents into later times. From the perspective of legal historians, Tiberius' rule represents an important turning point in the development of Western law. The perversion of judicial processes for cruel purposes highlighted the need for structural safeguards against arbitrary power. Later, Roman jurists developed principles aimed at preventing such abuses. But these efforts met with limited success under the imperial system. The idea that the law should also bind rulers, that procedure was as important as outcome, and that justice could not be left solely to the will of the emperor, became more sharply defined through the negative example of Tiberius. A final assessment of Tiberius must acknowledge both the banality of his evil and its terrifying nature. Despite all the atrocities, the empire's daily life continued. Merchants traded, farmers worked the land, and soldiers continued their training. The coexistence of normal life and horror is itself a source of fear. It shows how human societies can adapt to almost anything. The victims on Capri likely heard the songs of fishermen and remained indifferent to the screams coming from the villas above. As we examine one of the darkest chapters in history, we encounter questions that go beyond the details. How can a human being become so evil? What systems enable and nurture individual corruption? Why do good people fail to resist? These questions are not merely historical curiosities, they are warnings. Tiberius is dead, but the conditions that created him, the concentration of power, the collapse of accountability, the normalization of cruelty, can reappear in any era. Today, the island of Capri is one of Italy's most popular tourist destinations. Visitors marvel at the views Tiberius once admired and walk the paths he once walked. Few think about what happened there. Perhaps this is natural. Life goes on. History is forgotten. Beauty remains. But forgetting carries dangers. Every sunset over the Mediterranean also sets over landscapes where unimaginable suffering once took place. This contrast between natural beauty and human evil reveals a fundamental truth about humanity's capacity for both greatness and depravity. Tiberius died on March 16, 37 AD, at the age of 77. Some say he was strangled by his new Praetorian prefect, Macro, while others claim he died naturally and alone. What matters is that he died without repentance and continued to plan executions even on his deathbed. According to some sources, his last words were about his suspicions regarding those around him. He died as he had lived, paranoid, cruel, and utterly surrendered to evil. The man who had inherited the greatest empire in the world left it morally poisoned, politically traumatized, and spiritually scarred. The Roman crowds who shouted "Throw Tiberius into the Tiber" were expressing more than their hatred for a dead tyrant. They were trying to cleanse their collective trauma, to wash away the stains of 23 years of terror in the river's waters. But some stains are so deep that no river can remove them. The Roman Empire would endure for centuries, experiencing great victories and terrible collapses, but the wound Tiberius inflicted on its soul would never fully heal. Rome saw in him what it could become at its worst, and that knowledge could never be forgotten. History remembers Tiberius not merely as a bad emperor but as a fundamentally corrupt human being. Although historians continue to debate the details and motivations, the core judgment has remained unchanged since antiquity. He proved that unchecked power can create monsters, and that the darkest sides of human nature are deep enough to shock even the most cynical observers. His name became synonymous with depravity in the ancient world, and a shorthand for the most extreme forms of tyranny. Even 2,000 years later, that association endures, a testament to the lasting power of evil to leave its mark on history. But perhaps the most important lesson to be drawn from Tiberius is not about him, it is about us. His rule was sustained by the choices of thousands, who chose obedience over resistance, self-interest over principle, and mere survival over virtue. Every guard who threw a child from a cliff, every senator who sent a colleague to death, every trafficker who supplied victims, all made a choice. No matter how powerful, the evil of a single person cannot spread so widely without the collaboration of others. It is in this complicity that both horror and lesson lie. Evil on such a scale is not the work of a single monster. It is the product of a monstrous system made possible by the cooperation of ordinary people. As we close this dark chapter, we are reminded of how fragile civilization is and how easily the thin veneer of law and morality can crack under pressure. Tiberius represents what emerges when that surface shatters, the beast beneath the toga, the monster that power can draw out of a human being. His reign is history's starkest warning about the cost of unchecked authority and the depths of evil in the human heart. If we forget this, we risk reliving the horrors of the past. The tremors of Tiberius' reign echoed through Roman history and beyond for centuries. Every tyrant who followed was measured against the standard of his corruption. Every abuse of power brought Capri to mind. The Roman people learned that emperors could become monsters. This knowledge fundamentally changed the relationship between ruler and ruled. Once trust is broken so deeply, it can never be fully repaired. The principate that Augustus had created as a cure for civil war evolved into a system capable of producing evils more terrifying than the wars themselves. In the end, Tiberius' greatest crime may have been the poisoning of hope. He showed Rome that progress was not inevitable, that civilization could regress, and that not even the achievements of law and culture could necessarily stop the growth of determined evil. Senators who had once debated the fate of nations became cowardly soldiers who had conquered the world became instruments of depravity. Roman law, humanity's gift to the world, was turned into a tool of oppression. In Tiberius, we see not only the evil of an individual, but the vulnerability of entire institutions in the face of malevolence. And yet, even in this darker story, reasons for hope remain. Tiberius died. His evil, no matter how powerful, was not immortal. The Roman Empire endured and produced good rulers as well as bad. Human dignity, though trampled, was not destroyed. Writers like Tacitus and Suetonius ensured that the truth was not forgotten. They prevented the victims from being completely erased. By recording the horror, they performed an act of resistance and enabled future generations to know what had happened and to try to prevent its recurrence. The story of Tiberius reminds us that the price of civilization is constant vigilance against the darkness within ourselves and our societies. It requires limiting power, making laws binding on everyone, and protecting the weak from the strong. These lessons, written in the blood of the victims, remain relevant in every age. As long as people hold authority over other people, the potential for this kind of evil will persist. Our only defense is to remember, to learn, and to build institutions strong enough to prevent monsters from turning their private darkness into public policy. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean and the golden light that once illuminated Tiberius' crimes falls again upon the sea, our duty is to bear the weight of memory. Tourists rushing to Capri's beauty should also remember its horrors. Students of Roman history should understand how fragile the foundations of civilization's achievements truly are. Citizens of every nation should know that their freedom depends on an unending vigilance against those who would abuse power. Tiberius may be dead, but the conditions that made him possible still exist, waiting for us to let our guard down so that new monsters can emerge. In the end, Tiberius is history's harshest warning about humanity's capacity for evil. His era shows that when all checks on power are removed, corruption knows no limits. But it also teaches that no matter how powerful evil appears, it is ultimately defeated. Tiberius died hated and alone. His name was cursed, his memory reviled. The empire he corrupted outlived him by centuries, and the human spirit he sought to break ultimately endured. In the tension between human evil and human resilience lies both the horror and the hope of history, and it is up to us to preserve memory so that we can preserve hope.